Boldwood presents The Good Patient, written by Alex Stone and read by Antonia Beamish. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Now, September. Not again. The foggy drowsiness that weighed against me was disturbingly familiar, as was the throbbing in my head that penetrated through the darkness. It was persistent, nauseating. I knew pain. I was used to it, numbed to it. It had been a part of my life for so long. But it was a part that I had promised myself was over now. Enough was enough. At least, that was the plan. And yet, my eyelids fluttered as I tried to summon the strength to open them. Shards of bright sunlight instantly blinded me, and I scrunched my eyes closed again. I lay still, sheltered in the darkness. My brain felt lethargic and hazy. It was tempting to allow myself to drift back to sleep. Not again. That one thought was enough to cling to, enough to keep me going, enough to survive. I fought to focus my thoughts, internally checking in with every part of my body, assessing the damage. Nothing felt broken, nothing else hurt. Cautiously, I wiggled my toes. I could still move them. A rhythmic beep caught my attention. There was something familiar and calming about it. I inhaled deeply. The overpowering, bitter, clinical scent filled my nostrils. I smiled slightly. I knew that smell. Most people hated it and what it represented, where it represented. But to me, it was safety. It was kindness. "Miss Taylor?" A deep voice disrupted my thoughts, and I cautiously opened my eyes again. I squinted at the figure beside my bed, dark-haired, with a light brown skin tone. He was wearing blue scrubs, and the stethoscope around his neck gleamed as the sunlight reflected off it. He poked his black-framed glasses with his forefinger, pushing them higher on his nose. "I'm Dr. Menon," he said, with a soft, lilting accent. "I treated you about 6 months ago." Abhilash. I remember. My voice was groggy and faint. Despite the drowsiness, I remembered him. How could I forget? "That was quite a blow you took to your head," he continued, as he studied the notes in his hands. He looked up, and his eyes met mine. "You had us worried." I could see the corner etched into his features. He was telling the truth. His concern was genuine. He had been worried. About me. I swallowed. "I'm sorry," I mumbled softly. Guilt pressed against my chest. Another sensation I was too acquainted with. "I'm just glad you're okay. That's all that matters." I started to nod, but the pounding in my head made me instantly regret that action. But he was right. Despite the pounding in my head, I was okay. In fact, I was better than okay. I was back in hospital, but this time was different. Everything was different. "Keep your head still and follow my finger with your eyes, please," he said, as he leaned towards me and raised his index finger. Disappointment washed over me as he moved his finger slowly in an H pattern, about 30 centimetres in front of my face. What had I expected? He was just doing his job. "There are a couple of police officers here," he said, straightening his back. "Police?" I shifted awkwardly. "They want to ask you some questions if you feel up to it." There was a protective tone to his words. He would send them away if I asked him to. He'd do it for me. "It's fine," I told him. There wasn't much point in delaying it. He would only be able to hold them off for so long. I might as well deal with their questions now. He nodded and backed out of the cubicle. "Okay," I heard him say. "You can go in now, but only for a couple of minutes. She needs to rest." I swallowed as two uniformed officers walked towards the foot of the bed. "Miss Taylor, I'm P.C. Smith and this is P.C. Jennings." The other officer nodded as P.C. Smith said her name. "Can you tell us what happened?" P.C. Jennings asked. I tried not to flinch at the question. It was one I'd been asked so many times before. People always wanted to know, wanted to help. At least, that's what they claimed. But the reality was, no one was that selfless. There was always a reason, a motive, something to gain. I glanced at the open doorway. Well, maybe not everyone. "Miss Taylor?" P.C. Jennings prompted, stepping into my line of sight. I drew in a deep breath and tried to recall. How had I got here this time? "I was in the water," I said slowly, the vague memory of my body rhythmically bobbing, swept up in the current, as darkness descended upon me, like morning fog creeping in. "Yeah, you were found unconscious in the water. The Coast Guard said your life vest saved you from drowning." "My head." I lifted my hand and tentatively touched my forehead. It was bandaged, but even so, my gentle touch made me wince. "I hit it." The police officers watched me, silently waiting for me to continue. I squinted, trying to summon the memories from the murky depths of my mind. Why was I in the sea? "Your life vest saved you." P.C. Jennings' statement circled in my brain. If I'd been swimming, I wouldn't have been wearing a life vest. I only wore that when I took the jet ski out. The jet ski. That was it. I was out on the jet ski. The officers glanced at one another, and I knew from their expressions that this revelation wasn't news to them. "But how did you end up in the water?" P.C. Smith asked as he shifted position, attempting to block the low September sun from his eyes. I frowned. There was something about the sunlight that felt off, as though it didn't fit. Wasn't there a storm brewing? P.C. Smith nodded. "This morning. It got pretty bad for a few hours. The rain has stopped now, but the wind is still strong. Not really ideal weather for jet skiing. Why did you go out in that?" "It wasn't that bad when I set out. I thought I'd beat it." P.C. Smith's expression showed how reckless he thought that decision had been. He was right. It had been foolish. And yet, I closed my eyes. I could almost feel the spray in my face. The jet ski lifted as I flew over the crest of another wave. I was going so fast, too fast for the choppy conditions, but I didn't care. I felt powerful, strong, free. There was another wave already heading towards me. It was even bigger this time. Common sense told me I should slow down, head back to shore. I'd never ridden when the sea was so rough before. I wasn't experienced enough. My heart pounded. I felt alive for the first time in so long. I tightened my grip and accelerated more. I was tired of being sensible, contained. I wasn't ready to go back. A surge of power rippled through my body as the jet ski sped up. And then suddenly the engine spluttered. I glanced down at it, taking my gaze off the horizon as the steering became heavy and sluggish. I was no longer flying over the top of the water, but trudging through treacle. Something was wrong. Panic welled in the pit of my stomach, my body instantly recognizing that everything had changed in one split second. Without power, I would be stranded out here. I looked up and gasped. I wasn't just stranded, I was defenseless. Without the power of acceleration, the wave no longer looked like a tempting challenge, but a terrifying monster. I lurched forward, hunkering down against the jet ski, praying it would offer some protection, just as the wave hit. My eyes flew open. The engine cut out, and I got knocked off the jet ski. My fingers instinctively gripped the bedsheet that covered me, as though it could offer any protection from the force of the impact. I could feel the blow as the wave threw me forwards, banging my head against the jet ski. It was like being thrown head first against concrete, hard, disorientating, painful. And yet alongside the pain, there was something else too. Disappointment. A void I felt inside from the absence of power. Immersed in the icy water, I felt my grip slip before everything faded to nothingness. And Josh Carter? I blinked. What about him? What happened to him? I frowned. I don't understand. He's missing. Missing? I repeated the word slowly as my brain struggled to make sense of it. What do you mean he's missing? A sense of dread weighed heavily against me. You were the only one pulled from the water. The Coast Guard hasn't been able to find Josh yet. My eyes widened as I stared at them. He had an accident too. The officers exchanged an uncertain look. He was with you on the jet ski, P.C. Jennings said hesitantly. I shook my head. No, I was alone. Are you certain? I heard the doubt in her voice. I lifted my hand back to my forehead, but it did nothing to help ease the pounding that reverberated through my skull. I was alone, I repeated. I knew I was. I wouldn't have gone out with Josh. Not today. Not ever again. Josh sent a text to his brother Paul saying that the two of you were going out on the water together just like usual. Why would he tell him that? I shook my head. We found your car in the Harbourside car park in Poole. I nodded. I used the beta slipway there. We found Josh's car at the other end of the car park. I blinked. You did? Sunday morning is when you and Josh usually take the jet ski out. Well, yes, but the two of you, together. Normally, yes. So why not today? The pounding in my head grew stronger, more persistent. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. I ran my fingers through my blonde curls, wincing slightly as they caught on a knot from the dried salt water that had matted my hair. Sorry, officers. Dr. Menon's voice from the doorway cut through the silence. I stared at him, stunned. I hadn't even realized he was there. You're going to need to leave now so my patient can get some rest. He was protecting me again. Just a few more questions. My patient sustained a severe head injury. P.C. Jennings nodded. We'll come back when she's less confused. I frowned. Was I confused? P.C. Smith nodded as he followed his colleague out of the cubicle. I stared after them, relieved they were leaving, but unease still churned in the pit of my stomach. They were police officers. They were good. They helped people. Except they had the power to turn my world, my life, upside down, just like before. Thanks, I said, as the officers left. Dr. Menon nodded and turned to the monitor. Your vitals look okay, he said before turning back to me. He placed his hand beside mine. Can you squeeze my fingers? I wrapped my fingers around his and squeezed as instructed. Pull my hand towards you and then push me away so I can check the strength of your upper limbs. I obeyed again. Good. And the other hand? We repeated the process. He nodded again as he started to pull his hand away, but he paused. He glanced over his shoulder before turning back to me, the corner of his mouth twisted upwards in a hopeful smile. So, Lauren, he whispered, did you do it? Chapter 2. 4 months earlier, May. I hugged my right wrist to my chest as I sat in the waiting room. It was broken. Even with my non-existent medical training, I could tell that. The 2 paracetamol I'd already taken weren't really doing anything to numb the pain, but it wasn't anything I couldn't handle. After all, I'd handled worse. I glanced down at it, studying the deformed shape. I didn't want to see it, and yet something kept making me look. Some sense of morbid curiosity, perhaps. Like covering my eyes when watching a scary movie, but still peeking through my fingers. Because even though I told myself I didn't want to know, didn't want to see, the truth was some part of me did. I was fascinated. Repulsed, but fascinated. My gaze drifted around the busy waiting room. Everyone looked harassed and worried. I watched as new patients entered, wide-eyed as they studied the signs, desperately checking they were in the right place. They looked overwhelmed by it all. They didn't want to be here. I couldn't blame them. It was unfamiliar and scary, at least to them. Hospital staff zigzagged through the crowd, their pace hurried and decisive. There was an order to it all. The atmosphere felt charged with a buzz of energy. It was structured, purposeful, safe. "Lauren Taylor!" I turned at the sound of my name being called. A male doctor stood in the corridor, his eyes scanning the room. I stood up and walked towards him, protecting my wrist against my body as I moved. "Miss Taylor?" he asked, and I nodded. "I'm Dr. Menon." His subtle Indian accent added extra warmth to his tone. "This way, please." He led me through to a small cubicle and signalled to a chair. "Have a seat, and let's have a look at that wrist." I sat on the edge of the chair and slowly held my wrist out for him to examine. I inhaled sharply as he touched my fingers. "Sorry," he said instantly. "I'm afraid it's broken." I nodded. "It looks like a possible fracture dislocation and may need manipulation, but I'll need an X-ray to confirm." I nodded again. "How did you do it?" he asked. "I fell off a ladder." He arched his eyebrow. "I'm such a klutz," I added, preempting his next question. His gaze flitted to my face for a second, before returning his attention to my wrist. But that split second was long enough. "It's not the first time you've been treated here." There was an unspoken question suspended in his words. I shook my head and laughed. "Like I said, total klutz." His expression didn't change. He didn't even crack a smile at my feeble attempt at a joke. He just looked up and studied me intently. "There were some questions raised by the doctor who treated you last time." I felt cold. I remembered those questions. I remembered the way the doctor had looked at me, pitying and fearful. He was just trying to help, of course, just like the doctors before him. I understood that, but I didn't need it. I was fine. "The frequency of your injuries had raised some concerns." I should have known it would be in the file. I should have known they would document it. Their doubts, their theories. I was taking up their time again, time that they needed for other patients. I was either careless or I swallowed. "They're not that frequent." Dr. Menon tipped his head to the side. "Well, it's not as though you're here every month, no, but you are here more than normal." Normal. That was a word that had long ceased applying to me. "And given your history..." "That was years ago." I cut through his words, my voice hard and cold. I didn't need him bringing up the past. It was my past, my burden, mine alone. "In situations like yours, it's not unusual for..." He paused. He was searching for the right words, the ones that would enable him to say just the right thing, the right way. But there was no right way. There never had been. Not about this. I could hear my own breathing, fast, laboured, loud. The sound of it seemed to echo in the small cubicle. Could he hear it too? Could he sense the panic rising in my chest? When children experience what you did, he started again, hesitant, unsure. I know the risks, I interrupted, saving him from his own internal battle, and saving me from hearing those risks laid out. Again. The therapist explained at the time. He nodded. And? It was such a simple word, but it held such weight, such implication. I'm not my mother. Chapter 3. Now. What? The word came out so broken and distorted that I wasn't even sure it had been my voice. Only the bewilderment on Abelash's face as he stared at me told me it had been me who had spoken. Did you leave him? Oh! My breath escaped my lungs in a gush. That. Abelash chuckled. Of course, that. What did you think I meant? A frown creased his forehead. Unless... His head turned as he glanced back over his shoulder to where the police officers had departed. We ended it on Saturday, I blurted out, without emotion. Abelash's eyes widened. We? I nodded, conscious that we sounded mutual, as though we'd both agreed. Yet in reality, it had been a long time since Josh and I had agreed on anything. So Josh was okay with it. Abelash covered my hand with his. He was okay with you. I nodded again. I knew what he meant, what he feared, what I had made him fear. I would have come with you, you know. We could have handled him together. Abelash squeezed my hand, as though trying to telepathically transmit his sincerity. I smiled. I know. He'd offered before, repeatedly. It was one of the things that had drawn me to him, that determination to protect me, to keep me safe. I relaxed back against the pillows. His sincerity was what made him so different to Josh. With Abelash, there weren't just words and empty promises. I had no doubt that he really would do anything for me. I inhaled sharply. Well, anything except perhaps one thing. The one thing that I wanted most of all. How come you didn't call me afterwards? He tried to pass it off as a casual question, but I could hear the undercurrent of hurt in his voice. I shrugged, pretending that it wasn't a big deal, even though we both knew it was. It was late when Josh left, and I didn't want to disturb you. I knew you had an early shift this morning. You needed your sleep. Abelash rolled his eyes. I still would have found a few minutes to talk to you. He shifted awkwardly, his expression suddenly apprehensive. Unless you didn't want to talk to me. Of course I did, but my voice lacked conviction. Abelash's frown deepened, and I knew he'd heard it too. My words sounded like a lie, but they weren't. I had wanted to call him, to talk to him, but he would have wanted to know the details. And right then, in that moment, I probably would have told him. I shook my head. I think I just needed a little time alone to process it all. I paused. Josh was everything at one point. I'd imagined us spending our lives together, growing old together. I know it was my choice to end things, and I know it was the right decision, but I think I still needed a moment to accept that it was really over. It was the truth, at least partially. Abelash nodded. I understand. You needed time to grieve. Grieve. I stared at him as the word churned my stomach. For your relationship, Abelash added hesitantly. Right. I nodded a little too forcefully. Grieving was exactly what I'd done, in my own way. So you haven't seen him since yesterday? Josh is missing. The police officer's voice repeated in my brain. No, I replied firmly. There could be no doubt, no question. The alternative was unthinkable. And yet, it was what I'd wanted. Josh gone from my life, totally, completely. The how was irrelevant, wasn't it? What had happened to him beyond Saturday night wasn't my concern. He wasn't my concern, not any longer. We'd ceased to matter to each other the moment we broke up, if not before. We had limped along in denial for so long. It was hard to know the exact moment that we had stopped caring. It hadn't been instantaneous, I was sure of that. It had been slow, like a gradual death, one that neither of us had predicted, and neither of us could prevent. But then again, perhaps only one of us had really been trying. Chapter 4. Then. An uncomfortable silence hung between us. Perhaps I'd been too abrupt. Dr. Menon was only expressing concern for me. I sucked in a deep breath. Doctors were always concerned for me. It came from a good place, I knew that. It was part of their training, or perhaps their nature. They wanted to help, to heal. I liked that part of it, the care, the attention. But I knew, beneath it all, there was an undercurrent of fear, almost expectation. They thought they knew me based on what was in my file, my past. And that part did not feel good. The doctor you saw before wondered if you'd hurt yourself intentionally. Dr. Menon persisted. He wasn't giving up. My skin bristled. I didn't. And this time? And there it was, the inevitable question that I'd known would come eventually. The doctors always came back to the same theory. They thought Mum's instability had become my own. Her need for attention had been so desperate, so excessive, that it had come with a price, one I had paid, repeatedly. Things like that damaged you. The doctors knew it. And so did I. How could I break my wrist intentionally? FOOSH, Dr. Menon said. It stands for fall on outstretched hand, he clarified, as I frowned. It could be the result of an accident, or potentially the fall could be intentional. I sat straighter and met Dr. Menon's eyes. I told you I fell off a ladder. My voice was firm. I didn't show any sign of weakness, no hesitation, no indication even for one split second that I might be lying. Perhaps I was wrong. I was like my mother after all. Right, because you're just clumsy. I knew from the tone of his voice that he didn't believe me. He didn't even try to disguise it. I said nothing. I was good at keeping quiet, biting my tongue and keeping my head down. It was the best way to stay under the radar. Not that it was always successful. I read the notes about your mother in your file. I nodded. That wasn't surprising. Cases like hers, like ours, were rare, but they were also dangerous. Everyone involved took great care to document even the tiniest detail. They tried to protect me. Tried, but failed. I'm sorry. I blinked. Dr. Menon's apology startled me. I was used to concern. I was used to questions and assumptions. But an apology? What for? That you went through that. That no one helped you sooner. I nodded slowly. Both of you, he added softly. I swallowed. He wasn't just sorry for me. He was sorry for her, too. He pitied us, pitied the life that we'd led, the life we'd lost. My breath caught in my throat. I felt something shift. A tiny crack in the wall that I had spent years building up around me. I tried not to think about the past, about her. It was better to stay angry, to hate her. If I allowed myself to feel compassion, to feel sad for her, Then it opened the door to many more emotions that I didn't want to feel, emotions that I had fought to block out. And yet they tormented me still. They were relentless, unwavering. The doubt, the guilt. I should have done more. I should have been more. "Can you tell me what's really happening?" Dr. Menon's voice cut through my self-loathing. I swallowed. He knew. Somehow, despite my adamance, despite my well-rehearsed performance, he knew. My jaw clenched as I gritted my teeth and tried to keep my emotions in check. He didn't say anything, but I saw the flicker of recognition cross his face, and I knew he'd noticed my reaction. It made me look guilty. I couldn't let him think that. The other doctors had had doubts, questions, but they didn't have anything concrete. They weren't sure, and yet even that doubt had caused complications for me. If Dr. Menon believed strongly enough that I was a danger to myself, there was no way he would let it go. It would mean more visits from social services again. That wasn't the kind of attention I wanted. I had my reputation to think of, my business, my life. And yet, my lip quivered. I wanted to confide in him. I wanted someone to know, to understand, to care. I blinked furiously, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to start flowing at any second. I wasn't even sure why they were forming. I was stronger than that. My emotions were buried so deep within that I couldn't even remember the last time I'd cried. At least, not in front of anyone else. My tears were saved for my pillow. It was the only confidant to my secret. Until now. "Lauren?" He was waiting for an answer, an explanation. My lips parted, but no words would come. Maybe it was as simple as it being the first time in a really long time that someone hadn't believed my "I'm fine," or more importantly, hadn't accepted it. I wasn't sure everyone did believe it. Not always. But they let it pass. They didn't delve any deeper. They didn't care, or just didn't want to know. But he did. He wasn't satisfied with my explanation. He didn't just roll his eyes, call me clumsy, and move on with his day. People had asked before. He wasn't the first. He wasn't even the most persistent. And yet there was something different about him, about the way he asked, the way he looked at me as though he could see into my soul. It was ridiculous. I knew it was ridiculous. He was just another doctor, curious, concerned. He had a job to do. That was all it was. All I was. And yet, I tried to recall the last time that anyone had looked at me that way. I knew pity. I'd lived with enough of it. But this was different. He was different. It was Josh. Chapter 5. Now. "Thanks for fetching my car," I said, as Abhilash parked on the drive, "and for driving me home." I touched my fingers to the bandage on my head. My doctor wouldn't let me drive with a head injury. Abhilash chuckled. "He sounds like a wise man, but you don't need to thank me, you know." He turned the engine off and twisted in the driver's seat to look at me. "I want to help you. I like to." I inhaled deeply, allowing the warmth of his tone, his presence, to wash over me. "I just want you to know I'm grateful." He nodded. "I know." I reached out and placed my hand on his shoulder, hoping my touch conveyed all the emotions that I couldn't put into words. He covered my hand with his and squeezed gently. "Don't worry, Lauren," he said, gazing at me earnestly. "It's all going to be all right." A lump formed in my throat as his words took me back. Another time, another doctor. "You're going to be all right, Lauren." An unfamiliar voice penetrated the darkness as I fought the drowsiness that made my eyelids heavy and uncooperative. I blinked as I peered around the unfamiliar room. A repetitive beeping grated on my nerves, increasing my determination not to give in to the desire to allow myself to drift back to sleep. I was in bed, I realized as I tried to focus. But not my bed, not my room. The beeping seemed to intensify as my breathing quickened. There were wires and tubes connected to me. What were they? I didn't want them. I tried to sit up, but I felt too weak. A strange whimpering sound escaped my lips as I refused to give up. I focused my energy on my right hand and reached for the tube to pull it out of me. "Everything's okay," the voice said soothingly. My gaze drifted, following the sound. A man I didn't know smiled at me. I grunted and resumed my quest to free myself of the tube. "No, Lauren, you need to leave that where it is." I turned at the sound of Mum's voice the other side of me. The man lifted my right hand and placed it back at my side. I tried to pull my hand free, but he refused to let go. "You're in hospital, Lauren. You were very sick. This tube is helping to make you better. Do you understand?" I blinked again, focusing on his words. Hospital. I was in hospital. I studied him cautiously. His funny blue clothes were like something I'd seen on TV. "Are you a doctor?" My question was so quiet, so mumbled, for a moment I wasn't even sure he would hear it. "Yes, I am. I did your surgery and came to check on your recovery." I frowned. I remembered being at home. My stomach had hurt. It had been so bad it wouldn't stop. "I had surgery." I tried to lift my head from the pillow to see my stomach, but I was covered in a white sheet. He nodded. "You were so brave and did so well." "I did?" I glanced at Mum for confirmation, and she nodded. "He saved your life, Lauren." My eyes widened as I turned back and stared at the doctor. "It's all going to be all right now," the doctor repeated. He smiled at me, his eyes locked on mine, full of warmth and certainty. It was calming, reassuring, at least to me. "How can you be so sure?" Mum's anxious voice carried from the other side of my bed. "I mean, I thought she was all right before, and look where we are now. She just had a stomachache. It's not usual for a 10-year-old. Just a tummy bug, that's all it seemed to be. There's one going around the whole school. But then she just collapsed." "You weren't to know," the doctor said soothingly. "But I'm her mother. It's my job to know. My job to keep my child safe." I could hear the guilt causing her words to wobble. I felt bad for her. She was so distraught, so tormented. And yet, a tiny part of me felt vindicated. She should feel guilty, remorseful, scared. I'd tried to tell her how much it had hurt. I'd begged her to make it better, to make the pain stop. She'd told me to stop making a fuss. I gritted my teeth. I wasn't the one making a fuss now. I'd almost died. And yet somehow it was all about her guilt, her pain. "It was an easy mistake to make," the doctor said, leaving my side to go to her. "Abdominal pain, vomiting and fever are all standard symptoms of a stomach bug. It's understandable that you didn't realize it was appendicitis." "But if I'd realized sooner," Mum's voice was practically a wail, "it wouldn't have perforated." "Lauren's appendix has been removed now. She's out of danger. And the peritonitis is being treated." "The what?" I asked. "The pain in your tummy was caused by your appendix. When it burst, it caused an infection. But we're treating you with antibiotics." The doctor nodded at the tube that ran into the vein in my arm. "You're going to be fine." "But what if she isn't?
What if—"
Mum choked back a sob, and the doctor's attention immediately refocused on her again. He smiled gently as he reached for a box of tissues from beside my bed and handed them to her. "Lauren's surgery went well, and she'll make a full recovery. She'll be back home with you in a few days." Mum took a tissue and dabbed at her eyes.
"She just collapsed,"
she repeated again. The doctor pulled a chair from where it nestled against the wall and placed it behind Mum. "Have a seat where you can be close to Lauren, and I'll ask a nurse to bring you a cup of tea." Mum sank into the chair obediently, and the doctor placed his hand on her shoulder. "You've had a terrible shock, Mrs. Taylor, but everything's going to be fine now." Mum looked up at him.
"Thank you, Doctor. You've been so good to us."
Her voice rasped as she spoke.
"I was so scared I was going to lose my baby."
She sniffed.
"I can't lose her. She's all I have."
"We weren't going to let that happen," the doctor said, and winked at me. "Not on my watch." I felt a sharp stab of guilt in my chest. I'd been spiteful, relishing in Mum's sorrow. Of course she hadn't meant for me to suffer. She hadn't known I was so sick. Even the doctor said it was an easy mistake to make. She'd just been trying to do her best for me, just like always. The doctor gave Mum's shoulder a gentle squeeze before taking a step back. "I'll come back and check on you both later," he said, as he disappeared behind the curtain that was drawn around my bed. I turned to Mum, her gaze still locked on the gap in the curtain where the doctor had slipped through, a slight smile easing the panic from her face. I turned away, shoving the past into the recesses of my mind as I rummaged in the glove box. I pulled out my house keys and phone. "That's where you left them when you went out on the water yesterday?" Abhilash arched an eyebrow. "That doesn't seem very safe."
"True, but they were safer than me," I added with a rueful laugh.
Abhilash rolled his eyes. "We definitely need to start taking better care of you."
"We?" I smiled. "I like the way you say that, like we're a team."
"We are,"
Abhilash said. He sounded almost surprised, as though I should know that already. My smile widened. We clambered out of the car, and I pressed the power button on my phone as I walked up the drive. "The battery is dead," I said. "I bet I have so many missed calls."
"They can wait until tomorrow, can't they?" Abhilash said. "Charge it in the morning. You should rest this evening."
"But maybe there will be news about Josh."
My voice trailed away. "Do you really need to know, right now?" There was a touch of hurt in Abhilash's tone. Josh wasn't supposed to mean anything to me anymore. He was my past, and a painful one at that. "You need to focus on your recovery." I shook my head. "You're right. It can wait." "I'm sure Josh will be found soon," Abhilash said. "I know," I replied without hesitation. But that knowledge wasn't as comforting as Abhilash had intended. I swallowed. Josh would be found. I was certain of that. Eventually. I slid the key in the lock, pushed open the front door, and stepped inside. I paused. The house felt different, empty, abandoned. And yet there was something more as well. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. Something I had always longed for. It felt like mine. "Are you sure it's okay for me to be here?" Abhilash's voice behind me pulled me from my thoughts, and I turned back. "Of course." I held the door open wider for him and stepped aside. "Come on in." He hesitated and cast a nervous glance behind him. I could feel the uncertainty radiating from him. It was the first time he'd been in my home. My home. It felt strange to think of it as mine. It had always been ours, Josh's and mine. We were a combined entity, joined, whole. And now,
My gaze fell upon the bulging black bin bags that lined the hall. I swallowed. I'd done the right thing, hadn't I? Abhilash brushed against me as he joined me in the hall. His fingers wrapped around mine, sending tingles through my body. I turned to face him and allowed the door to close behind us, cocooning us inside. "Are you hungry?" I asked, as I dropped my phone and keys on the little table by the door. "I can make you something." I took a step forward towards the kitchen, but Abhilash pulled me back. "I'll make it. You're supposed to be resting." He leaned forwards, and his lips brushed mine. "Doctor's orders." He started to pull away, but I reached up, threading my fingers through his short black hair. He kissed me again, longer this time, and I closed my eyes, savouring every moment. "Yes, Doctor," I murmured compliantly as we finally separated. "So, which way to the kitchen?" I pointed to the door at the end of the hall. "Great." Abhilash kissed my cheek. "You go and put your feet up and I'll start cooking." "No way," I objected. "I need to witness your culinary skills at work. The only thing Josh knew how to do was order takeout." Josh. An awkward silence descended around us. I shouldn't have mentioned his name again. I'd spoilt the mood, reminded us of the one thing we didn't want to think about. "Do you think the police will want to talk to me again?" I asked the question that had been tormenting me. Abhilash puffed out his cheeks and slowly let out a long, deep breath. "Possibly. I think I only stalled them at the hospital yesterday. Now you're home." My stomach stirred. No, I definitely shouldn't have mentioned Josh. "Is that his stuff?" Abhilash asked, jerking his head towards the bags. I nodded. It felt weird seeing all his belongings shoved into a few bags. That was all his existence came down to, a few crumpled clothes tossed carelessly into bin bags. Perhaps I should have made more effort. I could have folded them at least. But then, what was the point? I should move them, I guess. They probably wouldn't look good if the police saw them. Abhilash shook his head. "I'll do it." He paused. "Where should I put them?" We stared at each other blankly. "Do you think—" I licked my lips, my mouth suddenly feeling dry. "Do you think they might ask to look around?" "It's a possibility." We tiptoed carefully around the words neither of us could say. What if they didn't just ask? What if they didn't give me a choice? "Let's eat first and we'll figure it out," Abhilash said, and I nodded as I followed him into the kitchen, a gnawing in my stomach telling me that this wasn't something we could figure out over a meal. It was too big, too complicated, just like everything with Josh always had been. Chapter 6. Then. I clamped my mouth closed as I stared at Dr. Menon. I hadn't said that aloud. I couldn't have done. The words had slipped out unguarded. I hadn't meant to say them. I'd needed to say something, but not that. Never that. I couldn't accuse Josh. And yet, I had. I don't know why I said that. I fumbled over my words, my voice quiet and shaky. "Is it true?" Dr. Menon asked. I froze. To deny it now would make Dr. Menon more convinced that his previous suspicion had been right. I would look more guilty, more unstable. But to confirm it would be to betray Josh even further, to blame him, the man who had stood by me through everything. Because of him, I'd gained surrogate parents and even a brother. They weren't the same as the real thing. They couldn't be. But in a way, that's what made them better. Josh didn't deserve this. Not from me. We had our problems, he wasn't perfect, but then neither was I. "Josh is—" Dr. Menon's eyes automatically dropped to my left hand. "Your boyfriend?" he asked. I nodded as my thumb brushed across my finger, and I felt the absence of the ring I so desperately wanted. Dr. Menon pulled up a chair and perched in front of me. I waited for the doubt to show on his face. Blaming Josh had been foolish, not least because there was no way that Dr. Menon would actually believe it. My file held too much history, too many suspicions to cast doubt on the well-documented theory that his colleagues had pursued over the years simply based on one flippant accusation. "How long have you two been together?" I frowned. It wasn't the question I'd expected. It was so ordinary, so innocent, harmless. 12 years, I replied. We started dating at school and bought a house together after uni 6 years ago. Dr. Menon nodded silently, and I realized my error. He'd read my medical file. He knew my history. The pieces were fitting together in his mind like a giant jigsaw puzzle, one that I had never expected him to solve. My chest tightened. What had I done? "It's not what you think," I told him. "It's not all Josh." "I get it," Dr. Menon nodded. "You feel responsible, as though somehow you could have prevented it. Or maybe you even feel like you deserved it." I shifted uncomfortably on the plastic chair. Dr. Menon was so close to the truth. Too close. I was responsible. I always had been. "Domestic abuse cases are always complex," he added. "Domestic abuse?" My heart pounded. "No, that's not what this is. It's not how he is." Cold dread crept through my body. Why had I blamed Josh? Why had I cared so much what Dr. Menon thought of me that I would allow myself to betray the one person who had stood by me through everything that had happened? It hadn't even made things better. I hadn't alleviated Dr. Menon's fears. I'd just increased the scope. I'd entangled Josh in my mess now as well. Another cause for concern, another safeguarding issue. I'd always tried to protect Josh from the craziness of my life, even when he, along with everyone else, had discovered the truth about Mum. I'd still shielded him from the details. It wasn't for her benefit. I didn't owe her that. I didn't owe her anything. It was for Josh. Details didn't help. They were things to dwell on, to analyse. They didn't erode the questions. They simply created more. The questions were endless, unanswerable, intolerable. My silence protected him. It's what I did, what I'd always done, until now. "Every journey begins with a single step," Dr. Menon said softly. I stared at him blankly. "It's a quote by Lao Tzu," he added, as though that was supposed to enlighten me. I frowned. "I don't understand what that has to do with a broken wrist." "Everything." "Okay," I dragged the word out. "That clears that up then." He chuckled. I liked that sound. Deep, rich, warm. "Maybe it's about avoiding the next broken wrist or broken arm, or whatever it might be next time," he said slowly. A hollowness seemed to expand within me. Next time. He thought there'd be a next time too. I knew it. I always knew it. It was inevitable. And yet, at the same time, it was deniable. I ignored that voice in my head that screamed at me that this was bad, that this wasn't how life was supposed to be. Pain, guilt, recurring hospital visits. But that voice was wrong. This was my life. It had always been my life. "I know it might feel like you're trapped right now, but there's always a way out, a first step." I knew what he meant. Leave Josh. To him, that was the answer. He thought it was so simple. I'd made him think that. But Josh wasn't really the problem. I was. I always had been. This had been my life even before Josh. Another issue, another hospital visit. Dr. Menon knew that, but he still didn't understand. He couldn't. I don't need to make a first step. I don't need a new start. I don't want one. Things are fine as they are. Fine? Good, I corrected, silently cursing myself for my poor choice of wording. He tipped his head to the left as he studied me, as though trying to read my thoughts. If you always stick with what you're used to, how do you know if there is anything better? I didn't need better. I didn't deserve it. I just wanted Josh. We were good together. We were complete. Josh loves me, I said firmly. It was the one truth that I clung to, the one that had given me strength when my world had fallen apart. It was all I had. It was everything. Dr. Menon took a deep breath. Is that enough? Chapter 7. Now. My eyelids grew heavy as I pushed the remaining grilled chicken around on my plate, too tired to eat it. You should get some sleep, Abhilash said. I'll check on you in a bit. You don't need to do that. You should go home. I'll be fine. You need someone to stay with you after a head injury. The hospital had already kept me in over 24 hours since the accident yesterday. Surely I was out of danger now. I opened my mouth to question it, but Abhilash interrupted. You have your very own personal doctor on hand. Will you please let me do my job and take care of you? I clamped my mouth closed. I wasn't going to object. It was what I wanted, what I'd always wanted. Mum! Mum! My cries got more desperate as the pain in my stomach intensified. I'm coming, baby, I'm coming! I heard her footsteps as she ran up the stairs and swung my bedroom door open. It hurts so much, Mum, I wailed as I lay curled up in bed, my arms wrapped around my stomach, tears streaming down my face. For a second, Mum froze in the doorway, her eyes wide, her face pale. She was scared. I could see it. And then she nodded, as though jolting herself back into motion, back into control. She pulled her mobile phone from her pocket and stabbed at the buttons. Ambulance, please, she said with a surprising calmness. My daughter is having severe stomach pains again. Why does this keep happening? I asked her, even though I knew it was futile. Parents were supposed to have the answers, and yet no one seemed to have the answers for this. Not Mum.